The drive to the northern reach of the Ontario wilderness is a lesson in erasure. You begin in the noise of the city, a cacophony of sirens and electronic chatter that defines the modern soul. Then comes the highway, a gray ribbon that thins as the trees begin to crowd the horizon. Finally, there is the gravel track, a road that the provincial maps stopped acknowledging in the late 80s. I am a man who has always been hunted by sound. My ears are too sensitive. I hear the hum of the refrigerator 3 rooms away, the whine of the power lines in the walls, the relentless thud of my own pulse. I came to the Canadian Shield to find the zero. I wanted a silence so absolute it would feel like a physical weight. I parked my truck where the gravel turned into a wall of birch and pine. I unloaded my gear with a methodical slowness. Every clack of a buckle, every rustle of nylon felt like a transgression against the stillness. I hiked for 6 hours, moving deeper into a valley that seemed to drink the light. By the time I found the campsite on the edge of Lake Malice, the sun was a bruised purple, sinking behind a ridge of granite that looked like the spine of a buried titan. The campsite was a small clearing of silver moss and ancient stone. There was no evidence of human life here, no charred fire rings, no discarded bottle caps, just the trees and the water. The lake was a mirror of black ink, so still it didn't look like liquid. It looked like a solid, polished floor. I set up my tent, my movements practiced and silent. I didn't use a mallet for the stakes. I pushed them into the soft moss with the heel of my hand, feeling the earth give way with a wet, welcoming sigh. As night fell, the silence began to change. In the city, silence is the absence of noise. Here, silence was a presence. It had a texture, a thick, velvety quality that seemed to coat my skin. I sat on a flat rock by the water's edge, my headlamp turned off. I wanted to be a part of the dark. I wanted to be a void. For the first hour, it was perfect. My mind began to untangle. The static of my life, the failed marriage, the corporate debt, the relentless pressure of being seen, began to evaporate. But then I heard the heartbeat. It wasn't mine. My heart is a frantic, irregular thing. This beat was slow, deep, and rhythmic. It was coming from the ground beneath me. Thud, thud, thud. It was a frequency so low it bypassed my ears and resonated in my stomach. I put my palms flat against the granite. The stone was vibrating, not a tremble but a deliberate mechanical pulse. I turned on my headlamp, the beam cutting a violent white path through the dark. I shined it at the lake. The water was still a mirror, but in the center of the lake, a ripple was forming. It was a perfect, concentric circle, moving outward with a mathematical precision. As the ripple touched the shore, the heartbeat stopped. "Jake," a voice whispered. I spun around, the light of my headlamp dancing wildly across the trees. There was no one there. The woods were a wall of black and silver. The voice hadn't come from the air. It had come from inside my own skull, a sound like a needle scratching against a bone. "You brought the noise with you, Jake," the voice said. It was my own voice, but stripped of all emotion, a cold, hollowed-out version of my speech. "You are vibrating. You are loud. You are a leak in the quiet." I crawled back toward my tent, my breath coming in jagged gasps. Every intake of air felt like a scream in the stillness. I climbed inside the nylon shelter and zipped the door shut, as if a thin layer of plastic could protect me from the geography of the place. I lay on my sleeping pad, staring at the ceiling. Then the static began. It started as a faint hiss, like the sound of an old television between channels. It grew louder, a white noise roar that filled the tent. I put my hands over my ears, but the sound was coming from my own marrow. I could feel the static moving through my blood, a million tiny needles pricking my veins. I looked at my hands. In the dim light of the headlamp, my skin looked translucent. I could see my bones, and they were glowing with a dull, flickering light. I wasn't a man anymore. I was a receiver. I was picking up a broadcast from the earth itself. The voice returned, louder now, a thunderous roar in the static. "The shield is not a wilderness, Jake. It is a storage facility. We take the screams of the world and we bury them in the stone. We take the grief and the anger and the noise and we press them into the granite until they turn into silence. But you are still broadcasting. You are a beacon of noise in our archive. I felt the ground beneath my tent begin to soften. The granite was turning into a thick, black slurry. I was sinking. I lunged for the zipper, but the metal had fused into the nylon. I was trapped in a pocket of air, being pulled down into the belly of the valley. As I sank, the static cleared. For a brief second, I heard everything. I heard the screams of everyone who had ever died in the woods. I heard the last breaths of lost hikers from a century ago. I heard the prayers of the desperate and the cries of the lonely. It was a symphony of agony, millions of voices compressed into a single, agonizing note. And then the note stopped. I was in the dark. I was in the stone. I was no longer Jake. I was a single, archived memory of a man who wanted to be quiet. I am the silence you hear when you go too far into the woods. I am the reason you feel that sudden, cold shiver in the small of your back. I am the zero. My name is Adam Bay, and I am, or was, a painter. For years I chased light, the golden hour in the Tuscan hills, the stark white brilliance of the Arctic tundra, the bruised purple glow of a storm over the prairies. I believed that true art was in the capture of light, the perfect rendering of how the world presented itself to the eye. But then I came to the Ozarks, to a valley whispered about only by the oldest, most superstitious locals, and here I found a different kind of illumination. I found a color that would redefine my understanding of existence, a color that would ultimately consume me. I drove until the asphalt turned to gravel, and the gravel turned into a pair of faint dirt tracks that vanished into an impenetrable wall of green. I hiked for 2 days, pushing through dense thickets of dogwood and oak, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and unseen decay. My goal was a remote basin, marked on an old, hand-drawn map I'd found in a dusty antique shop. It was labeled in faddis ink, the Grove of Whispers. I was looking for a new perspective, a landscape untainted by human impression. When I finally broke through the last line of trees, I stopped dead. The grove was not a place of whispers. It was a place of screams, captured in color. The trees were painted, not with human hands, not with brushstrokes or spray cans. The very bark of the ancient oaks, the smooth skin of the birches, the rough texture of the maples, they all pulsed with an unnatural, vibrant crimson. The leaves, instead of green, were a deep, bruised purple, so dark they seemed to absorb all light, yet simultaneously glowed with an inner fire. Even the earth beneath my feet was a shade of rust that seemed to vibrate, radiating a subtle, throbbing heat. This wasn't merely paint. It was a living, breathing hue. It was the new red, as I would come to call it. A color that felt like an itch behind the eyes, a vibration in the marrow, a taste of metallic sugar on the tongue. It defied every pigment I knew, every principle of light and shadow I had ever studied. It was raw, primordial, and utterly terrifying. I set up my camp in the very center of this crimson cathedral. My art supplies, the oils, the turpentine, the carefully selected canvases, felt ludicrous, pathetic, against the monumental scale of this natural artistry. I didn't want to paint it. I wanted to understand it. I wanted to dissect its essence, to grasp the terrifying secret of its existence. I found that the color wasn't superficial. If I cut a shallow line into the crimson bark of an oak, a thick, luminous sap bled out. It was the new red, pulsing, warm, and viscous. It smelled faintly of ozone and old, sweet blood. I dipped my finger into it. It coated my skin like liquid velvet, seeping into my pores, a sensation that was both repulsive and utterly hypnotic. For hours I did nothing but stare. I watched the light shift, not across the trees, but within them. The crimson deepened, then softened, then flared with an internal luminescence that defied the physics of photons. My mind began to unravel in the face of it. The logical structures of my artistic training, perspective, composition, hue, saturation, all crumbled. This was beyond art. It was a fundamental truth, brutally rendered. Night fell and the grove intensified. The purple leaves became almost black, creating a ceiling of pure, absorbing darkness, while the crimson bark pulsed with a rhythm that mirrored my own heartbeat. My campfire, which I had reluctantly lit, became a pale, insignificant flicker against the overwhelming brilliance of the new red. I retreated into my tent, but the color followed. It wasn't just outside, it was inside me. My veins, which had always been a subtle blue beneath my skin, now throbbed with a faint, internal crimson glow. I looked at my hands, and for a moment I saw not my own flesh but a canvas. My skin was a pale, receptive surface, waiting to be painted. I closed my eyes and dreamt of colors that don't exist in the human spectrum, hues that made me weep with a beauty that was also a profound agony. When I woke, the dream had followed me. My campfire was not the same. The flames were blue, not the familiar yellow-orange of burning wood, but a cold, otherworldly sapphire casting a frigid alien light on my bewildered face. I reached out to touch them. They were icy. They produced no heat, only light, a light that seemed to drain the warmth from the air. I looked at my own hands again. The crimson glow in my veins was more pronounced now. It was climbing, spreading across my forearms, my chest, my face. My skin was becoming translucent, like thinly stretched parchment, revealing the intricate network of pulsating red beneath. I was becoming a living diagram of the new red. The color needs a witness, a voice sighed. It was not a voice of air or breath. It was the collective rustle of the purple leaves above me, a dry, papery whisper that filled my mind. The forest is gray without someone to see it. It is nothing until it is observed. Thank you for your eyes, Adam. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through the hypnotic awe. I scrambled out of my tent, the sapphire flames of my campfire casting my shadow in stark, terrifying relief against the pools crimson trees. I had to leave. I had to break the spell. This wasn't a landscape. It was a trap. I grabbed my sketchbook, my hands shaking so violently I could barely hold the charcoal. I tried to draw an exit, a path out of the grove, but the charcoal, when it touched the paper, bled not black but blue. The lines I drew were cold, alien, mirroring the frigid fire, not the earthy escape I craved. The grove was not just surrounding me. It was twisting my perception, forcing me to see its own truth. I tried to hack at the crimson bark with my pocket knife, desperate to draw something familiar, something brown and earthy. But the blade merely scratched the surface, producing more of that viscous, warm sap. It coated the knife, turning the steel into a glowing, living thing. Then I looked at my canvas, the one I had left leaning against a tree trunk. The painting I had made earlier, a faithful rendering of the grove's initial, overwhelming beauty, was no longer a landscape. It was a portrait. It was a portrait of me, but it wasn't a static image. It was a terrifying, dynamic representation of my transformation. My skin in the painting was no longer flesh. It was the rough, crimson bark of the oaks. My eyes, once human, were now two deep, bruised purple leaves, starring out with an unblinking, ancient wisdom. My mouth was a fissure in the wood, filled not with teeth, but with the spiraling grain of the tree trunk. The Adam in the painting was hollowed out, his essence replaced by the very pigments he had sought to capture. A sharp, agonizing pain erupted in my chest, spreading like wildfire through my glowing veins. My muscles began to stiffen, my joints locking into rigid, unyielding positions. My feet felt heavy, rooting themselves into the rust-colored earth. I looked down in horror as my toes stretched, elongating, twisting, diving into the soil like hungry tendrils. I was rooting. I was becoming part of the grove. "You are a beautiful witness, Adam," the leaves whispered again, their voices multiplying, surrounding me in a chorus of dry, papery sighs. "The new red is complete, and now you are its eye." I could feel my skin hardening, turning from soft flesh to rough, textured bark. My hair became brittle, then fused into the leaves. My arms stretched into branches, reaching for the cold, sapphire sky. The transformation was slow, agonizing, but utterly inevitable. I was becoming one of the painted trees, a permanent fixture in the grove, my consciousness still trapped, still observing, still witnessing the horrifying beauty of the new red. I am a tree now. My bark is crimson, my leaves are purple, and my roots drink deep from the rust-colored earth. My eyes, once keen for light, are now fused with the leaves, forever staring outward, forever seeing the color that consumed me. The sapphire fire of my old campfire still glows nearby, a cold, alien beacon for the next curious soul who stumbles into the grove. I can feel the life within me, the slow, deliberate pulse of the sap, the patient expansion of the wood. I am the silence you find in this valley, the chilling beauty that draws you in. I wait for the next artist, the next seeker of light. I will provide the pigment. I will provide the inspiration. And once they see the new red, they too will never be able to look away. They will join the chorus of the leaves, adding their own unique hue to the terrifying tapestry of the grove. The air in the high Yukon doesn't just get cold, it becomes a physical enemy. It is a dry, biting vacuum that leaches the moisture from your eyes and the hope from your heart. My name is Derek, and I am a geologist who specialized in impact craters. I spent my life looking for the scars left on the earth by things that fell from the sky. I was trained to see the world as a history of collisions, slow, grinding plates and sudden, violent strikes. But nothing in my textbooks, and nothing in my decades of field work, prepared me for the event site of 1994. I had been traveling for weeks across a territory that the maps had simply given up on. The further north I went, the more the world seemed to lose its texture. The trees became stunted, then vanished entirely, replaced by a vast, rolling tundra of gray shale and permafrost. By the time I reached the coordinates of the impact, the world had turned into a flat, monochromatic plain under a sky that was the color of a dead television screen. When I crossed the final ridge, I didn't see a crater. I didn't see a hole in the earth. I saw a mirror. Stretching out before me for miles was a horizon of black glass. It was a perfectly flat obsidian sheet that had replaced the valley floor. It wasn't rock and it wasn't ice. It was a flawless, polished surface that reflected the gray sky with a clarity that felt obscene. It looked like a window into a void. I stepped onto the edge of it, my heavy boots making a sharp, metallic tink against the surface. It was solid. It was cold. It was the most silent place I had ever been. I pitched my tent near the center of this glass sea. I had to use a diamond-tipped drill just to create enough of a fissure to seat my stakes. Every strike of the hammer rang out across the valley like a gunshot, the sound traveling for miles without a single tree or hill to dampen it. I felt exposed. I felt like a blemish on a perfect, dark eye. As the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks to the west, the glass horizon began to change. The gray sky faded, and the obsidian floor beneath me began to glow with a faint, internal light. It wasn't a reflection of the stars. It was coming from deep within the earth. I sat on my camp stool, the small, blue flame of my stove hissing in the cold. I looked down between my feet. The glass wasn't opaque. It was translucent like the surface of a frozen pond. And far below the surface, perhaps 50 feet down, perhaps 100, I saw a movement. I grabbed my high-powered flashlight and pressed the lens directly against the glass. The beam cut through the obsidian, illuminating the depths. I expected to see geological strata, or perhaps the remains of the meteor that had caused this phenomenon. Instead, I saw a camp. Down there, encased in the dark, frozen depths of the glass, was a tent. It was the exact model of my own. Next to it sat a camp stool, and on that stool sat a man. He was wearing my jacket. He was holding a flashlight. He was looking up at me. His face was a perfect copy of mine, but it was wrong. His skin had the texture of polished stone, and his eyes were not eyes. They were two white, flickering sparks of static. I moved my hand. A half-second later, the Derek below the glass moved his hand. I blinked. He blinked with that same nauseating delay. "Derek," a voice whispered. It didn't come from the air. It didn't come from my radio. It vibrated up through the soles of my boots, a sound that felt like it was being carved into my bones. "The world up there is too thin, Derek. the voice below said. It was my voice, but played at half speed, deep and resonant like the groan of a glacier. It is too fragile. Everything is always breaking. Down here the geometry is stable. Down here nothing ever changes. I stood up, my heart hammering against my ribs. The figure below stood up too. He began to walk toward the ceiling of his world, which was the floor of mine. With every step he took, I felt the glass beneath me soften. It was turning from a solid into a thick, viscous liquid. My boots began to sink, the black obsidian rising over my laces. I lunged for my pack, desperate to find my rock hammer. I needed to break the glass. I needed to shatter the connection before he reached the surface. I struck the ground with all my strength. Clang! The hammer bounced off. The glass didn't crack, it rippled. It was becoming more like water every second. I looked down and saw his hand, a pale, stony hand press against the underside of the surface. Where his fingers touched the glass, it became transparent, a pocket of clear air forming between us. "We are the census, Derek," the reflection said, his face now inches from mine, separated only by a thinning membrane of black liquid. "We are the archive of everything the sky has ever dropped. You aren't a visitor. You are a missing piece of the record." I felt the cold of the glass reach my knees. I was being pulled under, the obsidian acting like a slow-motion quicksand. I looked out at the horizon, and for the first time I saw them. All across the glass sea, other lights were appearing. Other tents. Other men and women sitting on stools, staring down at their own reflections. Hundreds of us, all scattered across the Yukon, sinking silently into the black mirror. I tried to scream, but the air in my lungs was suddenly as heavy as lead. My voice was no longer a sound. It was a vibration that belonged to the stone. "Don't fight the lag, Derek," the version of me below whispered. "Once the delay reaches zero, you'll finally be in sync." I felt the glass close over my head. It didn't taste like water, it tasted like silence. The gray sky vanished, replaced by the dark, comforting weight of the obsidian. I looked up and saw my tent from below. It looked like a small, white cloud floating on a dark sea. I saw the surface tension reform, the black glass becoming solid once again. I am the reflection now. I sit in my tent 100 feet below the Yukon floor. I watch the sky through the dark lens of the valley. I see the next geologists arrive. I see them marvel at the perfect obsidian. I wait for them to pitch their tents. I wait for them to look down. I am very patient. Down here, time is just another layer of the rock, and the horizon is always waiting for a new face to hold. The isolation of the Great Lakes in late November is a special kind of purgatory. I am a man who has spent my life in the presence of engines, industrial turbines, heavy machinery, the relentless thrum of the city. My name is Will, and I came to the superior North Shore because I was tired of hearing the world move. I wanted to find a place where the air was still, and the only sound was the geological patience of the rock. I didn't realize that when you strip away the noise of humanity, you don't find silence. You find what the silence is hiding. I pitched my tent on a jagged peninsula of basalt that jutted into the lake like a broken tooth. The water was a slate-gray void, stretching toward a horizon that didn't exist. There was no wind, yet the lake was never still. It heaved with a slow, rhythmic swell, a deep tissue pulse that seemed to originate from the center of the earth. I was 5 miles from the nearest trail, alone with a month's worth of supplies and a hunger for a solitude that would finally quiet the ringing in my ears. I am a methodical man. I set up my stove, checked my bare canisters, and hammered my stakes into the rare, mossy fissures between the basalt slabs. The metallic clink of the hammer was the only sound for miles, and it felt like a violation. I felt the lake flinch every time the metal hit the stone. By the time the sun, a pale, heatless coin, vanished behind the tree line, I was sitting on a driftwood log, watching the dark take over. That first night, the vibration began. It wasn't something I heard. It was something I felt in my molars. It started as a low-frequency thrum, a hum so deep it made my vision blur in time with the pulse. I checked my equipment, thinking perhaps a fuel canister was leaking or my radio had malfunctioned, but everything was dead. The hum was coming from the peninsula itself. It felt as though the basalt was a tuning fork that had been struck by a giant. I retreated into my tent, zipping the fly tight. I lay on my back, staring at the nylon ceiling. The vibration grew. It began to take on a melody, not a musical one, but a sequence of mathematical tones that felt like they were being scraped across my ribs. Drone pulse decay. Will, a voice said. I didn't jump. I couldn't move. The vibration had pinned me to my sleeping pad like a specimen under glass. The voice didn't come from the air. It came from the water beneath the rock. It was a wet, heavy sound, like the splash of 1,000 stones hitting the surface at once. Will, you are out of tune, the voice said. It was my own voice, but it had been processed through a mile of cold, dark water. It sounded ancient and waterlogged. You are a sharp note in a flat world. You are a discord, and the lake does not like discord. I forced myself to sit up, my head spinning. I looked at the floor of my tent. The basalt beneath the nylon was glowing. A dull, sickly violet light was seeping through the cracks in the stone. I crawled to the tent flap and looked out. The lake was no longer gray. It was white. Millions of pale, sightless fish had risen to the surface, their bellies turned to the moon. They weren't dead. They were vibrating. They were humming in perfect unison with the rock, their tiny bodies acting as resonators for the deep pulse of the lake. I grabbed my headlamp and shined it toward the water. The beam hit a figure standing at the edge of the peninsula. It was a man, dressed in the same flannel shirt and heavy boots as I was. He was standing perfectly still, his back to me. "Who are you?" I shouted. My voice felt thin like paper tearing. The figure turned. It didn't have a face. Where the eyes and mouth should have been, there were only 3 circular holes like the openings of a flute. As he turned, the wind began to whistle through him, producing the same sequence of tones I had felt in my teeth. Drone pulse decay. I am the corrected version, the figure said, the sound whistling out of his throat holes. I am the one who learned to resonate. The lake is a great ear, Will. It listens to the stars. It listens to the shift of the tectonic plates. And it listens to you. You are a scream that won't end. We have to bring you into the chord. I scrambled back into my tent, but the stakes were already failing. The basalt was softening, turning from solid rock into a thick, crystalline slurry. My tent began to tilt, sliding toward the white, humming water. I tried to grab my bag, but my fingers were becoming stiff, turning into the same violet-tinted stone as the peninsula. I looked down at my hands. My fingernails were falling off, revealing 3 small, circular holes in each fingertip. I could hear the air beginning to whistle through them. The silence isn't empty, Will, the faceless man said, standing now at the edge of my collapsing tent. The silence is a pressure. It's a weight that eventually breaks everything that isn't hollow. Don't fight the resonance. Let the lake play you. I felt the cold water hit my legs. It didn't feel like liquid. It felt like a vibration that was erasing my atoms. I wasn't drowning. I was being transcribed. My memories, the city, the engines, the sound of my mother's voice, were being pulled out of my head and turned into the humming of the fish. I am the peninsula now. I am the basalt tooth jutting into the void. My consciousness is scattered across the slate-gray waves, a million tiny notes in a song that never ends. I can feel the next campers arriving. I can feel the weight of their boots, the sharp, discordant noise of their voices. I wait for them to pitch their tents. I wait for the sun to go down. And then I begin to hum. I begin to vibrate their bones. I begin to carve the holes into their skin, because the lake needs its choir and the song must be perfect. If you come to the North Shore and you hear a sound like a flute in the wind, do not listen too closely. That's just me trying to find your key. That's just me getting ready to bring you into the fold.